but we can no more grasp love, it seems to me, than we can grasp God. And if we could, we would bottle it and sell it, But it is always something that's its face changes.
Hello and welcome to ChatCTK, a podcast exploring life and faith at Christ the King Catholic Church in Nashville, Tennessee. I'm your host, John Stotts, Director of Adult Faith Formation here at CTK. In episode 8, I am joined once again by Father Dexter Brewer, pastor of Christ the King Catholic Church, to discuss the upcoming Sunday Gospel. We talk about what it means to love God, why loving our neighbor is an integral part of this, and how we know when we have successfully fulfilled the two greatest commandments. It's been some weeks since we've had the opportunity to sit down and reflect on the gospel, so thanks for coming back.
Absolutely.
I wanted to start with last week, actually. I was at the 6 p.m. Mass and was quite moved by your homily. You talked at length about the image of God in the context of the gospel, which is about the attempts of the Pharisees and the Herodians to trap Jesus and producing a coin with the image of Caesar. And you talked about how there are not, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but there aren't parts of us, or there aren't parts of us that belong to God and parts of us that belong to others. Though we owe different people different aspects of ourselves, in some sense, all of us is made in the image of God. Is that right?
Yeah, I was I think I mentioned it. I was at a football game, and I was one of my friends brought his grandkids to our gathering, and as they filed in, they all looked like John. And I've known John since we were in law school back in 1979. So to see these little ones walk in, I knew exactly to whom they belonged. Because they had his image, their face had his face, and it just occurred to me that we can tell who belongs to whom because of the image that we bear, and as you were saying, that image, it's not split. That we are not split as people. That seal on us, which signs that we belong to someone. Means that all of us, it seems to me, belongs to, you're not just part of the grandchild. Or you can see it in married spouses,
right,
in their faces and all.
Right, and beginning to use similar turns of phrase. Right. So we would expect that as we grow closer to God, I suppose, we become to resemble God more clearly, just like spouses who live together over a period of time.
I would think that's right.
And yet everyone also, it would seem, has their own distinctive way of doing this, so that as each of us grows into that image, what it looks like Dexter to be the image of God will not look like what it looks like John to be. And yet we're all sort of growing into that, which could only happen, I suppose, if God were infinite, which God is. That we could all sort of infinitely, that the perfect human is just one facet of put them all together, and we still wouldn't quite make up what it means to be God.
I often imagine, maybe I've said this before, but God is that collage of faces. From a distance, it's a face. When you get close to it, you realize that it's made of 100 million faces.
Right. Right. So this week, we see another attempt to publicly discredit Jesus. And maybe it'll be the occasion to talk a little bit more about what it means to be in God's image and what Jesus expects of us. Would you mind reading the gospel reading?
This is the gospel according to Matthew. When the Pharisees heard that Jesus had silenced the Sadducees, they gathered together, and one of them, a scholar of the law, tested him by asking, "Teacher, which commandment in the law is the greatest?" He said to him, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the greatest and the first commandment. The second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. The whole law and the prophets depend on these two commandments." the gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ. You're a lawyer, right?
Mm-hmm.
You practice law. Has anyone ever asked you what the most important law is, in a civil context, or would this question make any sense to common law practice?
No, but I think if you ask someone of our country what's the greatest law, we'd have to say the Constitution, right? I mean, that's kind of the foundation of all things.
Yes.
And against which everything is measured. So if it doesn't, measure up to the standards or whatever it is the Constitution requires, then it can be no law in our country.
Yes.
So everything else. But other than that, no one's ever asked. There's so many different parts of the law, so many kinds of law.
Right. Well, even within the Constitution, if you had to pick one aspect within the Constitution, is there something within that all other things should be measured according to?
Oh, my word. I never thought of that. We have the Bill of Rights, and but I don't know that you could say that any one of them would be more important than the others. Do you know what I mean?
Right.
The freedoms that we have,
right,
or the rights to privacy and all those things which are protected in some of the bills, some of the those sections. So I don't know the answer to that.
Well, and I think about that in this context. There are 613 commandments in the Jewish law. So that's a lot to argue about if you're going to choose one and it's a similar conversation. Which one does all the others hang on? What's our interpretive lens here? If private property is the most important thing for us, and we interpret everything from First Amendment free speech principles to Second Amendment, if we all interpret that in terms of protecting private property, that gives us a very different kind of society. If the whole law is all about observing the Sabbath or avoiding adultery, that skews everything towards a certain practice, and it could all be consistent, but also it would be a very different way of life than maybe.
Right.
But here Jesus does give an answer, but it's kind of a paradoxical one, right?
It is, but I've often thought though that this question is put to him because they don't believe that he's Orthodox, and I say that because his answer is one that surely they would have expected of almost any good Jew, because this is something that they recite every morning, every evening. I mean, it's a part of their life. The Lord your God is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind, and on and on. So I'm not sure what they were expecting of him, except that if he weren't Orthodox, or if he wasn't like them, then he would say something else. But he clearly shows that he's he not only knows the law, but he knows what's what,
right,
and what's in first place,
right, and as a statement of personal principle,
yes,
what is important to him, because we could all have a different perspective on what's most important for me to practice right now, but Jesus clearly says that for him the most important thing is to love God, and also to love your neighbor as yourself. Now in Luke, this gets followed up immediately with the parable of the Good Samaritan, because the Pharisees come back and ask, who's my neighbor? But Matthew doesn't have that. Instead, Jesus is going to turn around and silence them with his own question, which we don't read about here.
But you said something that's really important. I think he answers this question from the point of view of what he believes. I mean, what directs his own life. This is what he does. I mean, if he saw this as some sort of test and he was trying to guess kind of what the answer was, or what he thought they thought the answer was, he may have, I don't know. I mean, even if he came up with the same answer, to me it would be strange. But when I answer based on kind of what it is that I believe, what I feel,
Yeah.
then no matter what anyone says, I mean, this is where I'm grounded. And I think that this answer says, this is what he's grounded in.
Yes.
The love of God with heart, soul, and mind. And that's the way he lives. And so, even if there were another answer,
Right.
this is his answer.
I was speaking recently with a colleague who's helped me in a number of ways putting together small group opportunities, Stacy Rockasalva. We were talking about an exercise that I think we've each done in the past where you're asked to identify your values, the things that you really care about, family, work, religion. And then you're asked to pull out your calendar and to pull out your bank account and to show where do you spend your time, where do you spend your money, and to see how well your actual practice of what you pay attention to every day, what you work towards, and where you spend your money lines up. And sort of, it can be jarring sometimes to say, well, my kids are the most important thing to me, but I never see them.
Right.
But, and we have justifications and their reasons, but that's the beginning of sort of interpreting your own values and saying, I know what I say is important. What does my life say is important? And here, I think Jesus is offering himself as an example. Put me to the test. See if what I am doing shows that what's important to me is loving God with my heart, soul, mind, and loving you. Loving all those around me. Right. And that's a very different metric, so to speak, than the one, of course, he will be ultimately measured against, when he's tried and convicted, which has to do with being a king or, here it's very simple. Mm-hmm. He is loving God and loving his neighbor.
But it's a hard thing to do, though. Most of us don't. We don't answer from that depth. We for us, life is it's almost a kind of game where we're trying to satisfy people out there by finding the right answer to their questions, rather than telling them what it is that's going on within. Sometimes that's too personal.
Yeah.
And sometimes we don't know, and sometimes we're it may not even be there, And so it is about kind of discerning. What do you want to hear? Let me see if I can figure out what you want to hear, and I'll tell you that, so that I sound good.
Yeah.
I mean, my answer sounds good. It sounds right. And but to be able to say to someone, this is what I believe. There's a scene in A Man for All Seasons when St. Thomas More is talking with Norfolk, I think, and Norfolk says something about the Pope, and St. Thomas More responds. I forget how he said I think Norfolk said, "Do you believe that?" He says, "Yes, I believe it." And then Thomas More says again, he said, "No, I believe it." I mean, he makes the point that this is, a part of himself. Do you know what I mean? And I don't think we get there often enough. We're playing with things and answers outside ourselves rather than speaking from the depth of our being.
Yeah, it's a way of maybe trying to take a shortcut.
Or being religious. Yeah, I mean, religious is all about answers and things, but most of it's outside ourselves.
Right.
We're moving around furniture and stuff and trying to look right or trying to sound right, but it doesn't connect somehow.
For me, loving God means loving the most important thing, the most valuable, that which is the most valuable thing that I can conceive. But as you point out, what if I don't know what that is? Because none of us comes into this life knowing what the most valuable thing is. We're bombarded with lots of claims on our attention, and it takes a lot of life to begin to sift through what's apparently valuable from what's really. But I think part of what it means to love God is to be willing to ask the question and to discard all the things that compete as the most valuable thing, saying, no, not this. There's something yet more valuable. Not this. There's something yet more valuable. And I'm not sure what we get at the end once we've sort of moved things, discarded them, not as being not important, but not the most valuable thing. But I think the quest, the desire to know what is this God that is somehow both the source of who I am, but also the end of what I'm supposed to be. We can't conceive of that. So sometimes we just say, well, no more of this. Like, I'm just going to go work and I'm going to play and we're going to live life without any depth. I think it takes some courage to test the answers we're given by our parents, our friends, our society that says this is what's most important, and to ask, is it so?
Yeah, this commandment is. I was saying last Sunday that Jesus' answer to the Pharisees and the Herodians, at least to my mind, wasn't very helpful. You know, I mean, because it leaves you trying to discern, kind of what is Caesar's and what is God's. And then similarly here, once he is, kind of articulated the greatest commandment, which is to love God with your heart, mind, and soul. The question is, well, how do you do that? God can't be seen, heard. And God is, and so we all know, we know the commandment. They know the commandment, but you're still left, it seems to me, with the problem of what does it mean to love God with your heart, mind, and soul. And I think that's why he's added the second part, which of course is not original to him,
right?
I think, but that somehow one of the ways that we can see something of our love for God is by our interactions with those who bear the image of God,
right?
Our neighbor,
right? I remember sitting in on a centering prayer workshop some years ago, and someone asked, I've been practicing for some time, this method of contemplative prayer. How do I know when I'm getting anywhere? And one response that this person received that I don't think she liked very much was, well, what does your family think? How are you with them? I think she wanted something different than how is it impacting your relationship with other people? Right. But I think if our prayer or any of the religious stuff, if it doesn't have something of a tangible benefit on our ability to be more patient, to be to create space for others to listen, then I'm not sure we're actually in communion with God. I'm not sure we're growing into God's image, who's always sort of endlessly patient and creating space for others. Right.
But the curious thing is that you may never know. I mean, right. It is. It's a good question. What does your community think? What do the people around you think?
Right.
And they can see a transformation in you that I may not be aware of. It's like that scene from The Wizard of Oz, where so the heart is not measured by how much you love, but how much you love by others.
Yes.
I mean, that is, they see something in you that you can't see. And they're responding to it. So everything's changing because of you, or because of something that in you that you're not aware of. And so centering prayer does transform you, but I may not know it.
Right.
But my environment knows it.
Right. And even the question, it's good to check in from time to time, but there can be sort of a self-obsessiveness that accompanies religious practice of checking in. How am I doing? Looking in the mirror, spiritually speaking, and saying, am I losing some spiritual pounds? Am I gaining some spiritual, and it's all about me. But here we get, if you're loving your neighbor as yourself, to my mind, you're looking at your neighbor. You're caring for your neighbor, not for yourself, or at least not not to the exclusion of either.
Yeah, but for people who, like the Pharisees, and I think I made the point that not all of them were like this.
Sure.
I mean, they were known for knowing the law and knowing precisely, and arguing about it and kind of trying to figure out what it is that God was asking of them through the law. For people who are so focused on the law in an ordinary kind of way, this might come as this may be uncomfortable to them, I think. Because lawyers pride themselves. I mean, they what they want is something that's fairly clear, so they can understand it and they can execute it. There's nothing worse than a law that's overly broad or that's that you can't get your head around. And so for lawyers and Pharisees, I would think that this would make them very uncomfortable, because loving God, even though they know this rule, and the second, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. They know that as well. It just seems to me that neither of those is so concrete, so spelled out that they can say, okay, now this is it. I know it when I see it. And that's what lawyers want. That's what religious people want too.
Yes.
You're not doing this because this is what it says, and you're not doing that, and therefore you're wrong and you're sinful, and and on. So
I think that's right. Following this seems to demand a relinquishing of control over judgment, because how am I to know if I'm loving God with my whole heart? Like, how can I possibly? I don't even know what God is. How can I know? And I'm not even sure what my heart is. I'm still.
And so the question is, do we even know what love is?
Right. And who determines whether I'm loving my neighbor? Is it me or is it my neighbor? At the end of the day, my ability to love my neighbor kind of depends on whether they have experienced my love. If I give them something and they don't like it, and I just say, well, that's how I love you.
Right.
That doesn't work very well. It doesn't work in relation-ships.
There is a great scene, and I maybe I brought this up before, but from Fiddler on the Roof, with Tevye and Golda. They, after 25 years, have been married, and I bring it up a lot in marriages.
Sure.
So if anyone's listening to this, and they were at my wedding, a wedding that I presided over, they'll remember this. But after 25 years, he turns to her and he says, "Do you love me?" And she doesn't know what that is. They were matched by a matchmaker, and she's uncomfortable even with the conversation, because love is one of those things that's just, how do you, do you know what I mean? What does it look like? And so finally, after he asks 3 times, he says, she simply looks at her life. She looks at their life together, and she says, "This is what we've been through."
Yeah.
And with the kids, and we haven't had this, and we've struggled with these things, but I'm still here.
Yeah.
And then he asks, "So then you love me?" And she says, "I suppose I do."
Yes.
But based on what I've seen, and our, the struggles and the fact that we moved through it and have stayed through it. And he says, "And I suppose I love you too."
After 25 years, my bet is his.
Right.
If that's not love, what is?
Right.
Then you love me?
Right.
Yes.
Right. "I suppose I do," she says. Right.
Then I suppose I love you
too.
Yeah. Right. That's
But we can no more grasp love, it seems to me, than we can grasp God. And if we could, we would bottle it and sell it.
Right. Right.
But it is always something that's its face changes. What you may need for love, for me, what your spouse needs, they're all different things. And sometimes with your kids, it may seem harsh, and yet to protect them and save them from danger, it may not on the surface look like love, but it is.
Right.
It is love.
Right.
So it's a difficult thing to.
And it would seem that we can't we can only have one God. We can't love God and mammon, as Jesus says elsewhere in this gospel. That is, to some extent, we can either make up our minds that our life is about learning how to love God and love our neighbor, and we will do what enables us to do that as we learn and grow. But when we decide that life is about something else and we try to just fit love of God into neighbor into that thing, I think it always suffers. Mm-hmm. It always loses. If the most important thing for me is bottling up something and selling it, and I'll try to do some love on the side, inevitably I'll find that I'm not very skillful because I'm not paying attention to, and love demands that we pay attention to the object of our love, that we learn from the object of our love just what it means. Just like a gardener needs to pay attention to how the flowers are doing. If she wants to figure out how to love them, she can't just follow a manual. She can't just follow the instructions. It's this craft. And so I see this as being, on the one hand, it is a very general commandment. On the other hand, with respect to our actual lives, it's very specific. It's focused, right. Who is my neighbor? Right. The guy right there. It's not the person on the other side of the globe. In most cases, it's not. It is the person that I encounter every day. And the task is to learn how to love that person. And I don't get to say, well, I'd rather love someone else. I'm going to go somewhere else and learn to love someone else. No, it's the person right in front of me. That's God. I think too about the end of this gospel, one of the final parables, which I think we'll probably hear, the parable of the sheep and the goats.
That's the last Sunday of the year.
Right. Where Jesus, the Son of Man comes and assembles all the nations. And on his right, there are sheep, and on the left, there are goats. But do you remember what's funny about the people who turn out to be the sheep? They ask.
Well, what I love about that story is that on both sheep and goats are unaware
right.
of what they've done when they've got it right and when they got it wrong. Okay, so when they're separated, the sheep are put sent off to eternal life because they fed the hungry, visit the sick, did those things which. And in doing that, they attended to the needs of the Lord Himself. And they asked, "But when do we do this?" It's almost as if they simply acted based on the fact that the one in front of them was like them,
Yeah.
And without any other reason other than you're human, no need for reward or any of those things, because anyway, so they and doing so they get it right. And the goats, at least my reading of it suggests that if they had known that in serving the little ones they would be serving the Lord, they would have done it. But they didn't see the little ones as one like them, and so they missed the boat, as it were.
Right, right.
So they were looking for reward.
Right.
Where the others were just being human and trying to be fully human. And the way that we do that is by engaging a neighbor,
So I guess in a way, if we don't know how to love God in the way that involves our heart, soul, and mind, the obvious place to start is to look around and to find someone or something to love and to take care of.
I think that's the only way we can do that. Right. And since, as we were saying, we all bear the very image of God, the divine image, because we are made in God's image, then that's a great place to start.
Yeah.
And if there's something more to it, then God will let us know.
Yeah. Thanks for the chat.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to ChatCTK. a new podcast exploring life and faith at Christ the King Catholic Church. Future episodes will feature interviews with CTK parishioners, staff, and clergy about their experiences of God, Catholicism, and faith in everyday life. Our gratitude to parishioner Brian Steinberg for graciously using his time to edit and process this podcast. You can find new episodes at our website, ctk.org/chatctk, or you can subscribe to the podcast using Spotify, YouTube, Apple Podcasts, or your favorite podcast app.